Well, good morning. We often say that you can tell what you're passionate about by the way that you defend it in conversation. I was in some conversation this past week as I have been traveling, and as we find ourselves halfway through the college football season, and as I have found myself outside of Louisiana in enemy territory around other folks who are passionate about their college football teams, we were in conversation about who has the better team, and as they were just picking on me and talking trash about LSU football or even the Saints, I found myself with no hesitation reaching right into the conversation and defending our beloved Bengal Tigers as well as our beloved New Orleans Saints. Why? Well, because I love LSU football and because I love our Saints. And the conversation was such that it would not be awkward or uncomfortable in order to enter into that type of banter. On the other hand, I think we've all been in situations in life where we've been around people whose priorities are different than ours. Their outlook toward life is different from ours, and the things that they are passionate about is different than ours. I think back to when I was a kid and those opportunities when we would be with our larger extended family, whether it be Thanksgiving or Christmas or any other of the holidays. And there'd be that point in the conversation where somebody would say something that might be a little off color. Somebody would say something that was humorous to them, but maybe just inappropriate for the context of the conversation. And there would be that awkward silence where nobody would really say anything, and we just kind of move along to the next topic of conversation. I look back on those opportunities and ask myself, why didn't anybody say anything? Whether it was a racist comment, whether it was a derogatory comment about one of the family members, or whether it was an insulting comment about our Catholic faith or about God Himself. And just kind of growing up, there was always that silence at the table, and nobody ever said anything, and we just kind of moved along. You can tell what you're passionate about by the way that you defend it. I guarantee you, if somebody would say something about my own mother or father, I would be quick to defend them and quick to stand up for their honor. If somebody would say something about one of my nieces or nephews or one of my siblings, I'd be quick to jump in to the conversation and to nip that in the bud. So it's important for us to feel how personal it gets when we are personally affected by the comments that people make about the things that we're personally passionate about. The first reading from today's Mass is from Romans, and St. Paul begins in chapter 1 and verse 16. He says, "Brothers and sisters, I am not ashamed of the gospel." I am not ashamed of the gospel. St. Paul was living in a world that was decadently secular. He was living in a world that was humanist. It was all about the human being, was all about the glorification of the human being. St. Paul was living in a world that was certainly anti-monotheistic. In other words, they had lots of other gods. And without being a doomsdayer, I think that sounds a lot like the world that I live in. That is certainly increasingly secular, that is certainly glorifying the human being, and certainly has lots of other gods rather than the one God that is revealed to us in the Old and the New Testament. And we are surrounded in a world that is ashamed of the gospel. We are surrounded in a world that is not only ashamed of the gospel, but is oftentimes aggressively against the values of the gospel and certainly the values of our Catholic faith. And as St. Paul says, he's not ashamed of the gospel. The question to us is, are we? How quick to defend publicly our Catholic faith? How quick are we to publicly help people understand the beauty of your relationship with God? How quick are we to publicly stand in our own testimony about what God has done to us? I remember when I was dating my first girlfriend, her father said there's two things that he never talks about in public, and that is religion and politics. And yet I can't imagine anything in the world that's more influential in a person's life than those two things. And so those are the things that we don't talk about in public. Are we ashamed of the gospel? Are we ashamed of the gospel, or are we afraid of what will happen in our relationships with people if we stand up for the gospel? And I think that's where the rubber hits the road there. That's where the rub of being a disciple is really felt. If I stand up for the gospel, if I say something right now, I'm going to be rejected. I might be judged. I might be categorized. I might be dealing with the consequences. And if you take it even closer to home, when our spouses have different priorities religiously than we do, it's easy for us just to get silent because we're tired of having that conversation. The fatigue leads to resignation. The resignation leads to silence. And the silence simply leads to affirming the very indifference that we've talked about. So when it comes to our own marriages, when it comes to our raising our kids, when it comes to our relationships with our siblings, our closest friends, are we ashamed of the gospel? I've often asked myself, who's forming who? You know, the gospel is supposed to form the culture, and I feel like the culture has much more influence over the gospel these days than the sacred text of Scripture influencing our own lives. As we begin this week, I would encourage you just to spend some time today without any fear or judgment, to spend some time today in prayer without any categorizing of yourself or any running away from the tension. And to simply today ask yourself, are you ashamed of the gospel? We'll unpack this throughout the week. Now here's the good news. God is not ashamed of you. God is not ashamed of what your actions have looked like. He's not ashamed of what your life looks like. And He's not ashamed of any silence in the past. So if you have a conversation with God today, just know that He's not ashamed of you. He brought you into existence and is longing to guide you in every conversation and every day. Trust the process. Let's trust how the week's going to unfold. And let's ask ourselves today, are we ashamed of the gospel?